start by talking about Jonathan Pageau. And I reacted to him, and I did videos about this, and had some interactions with him years ago about this. It's what, three years ago or so.
All right.
At the beginning of the Jordan Peterson business. And Pageau's idea is that art is all about what it's saying. It's all about the symbols, and everything comes from the symbols. And so he describes his icons. He says, you know, it's so beautiful and wonderful, and it's a language that everyone can understand. And then he says, you know, this symbol is here, and this symbol is here, and that means this, and that means that. And the problem with that is that you can reduce this meaning that he's talking about to a diagram. You don't need a beautiful icon for that. The icon can have all of that, and it can be all of the things that Jonathan Pageau, who's I guess he's converted to Orthodox Christianity, and so he's dreaming of the beautiful dream of the West being re-Christianized, and we get back into all this true stuff, and I'm on board with that. But my point is that given where we are in the West today, the first thing we have to do when it comes to art is, I mean, of course, it's good to remember that you can do beautiful things with art, but the first thing to remember is that it's a craft that works in a certain way. So contemporary art has completely disassociated the spiritual from the material in art, and created this terrible confusion and perverted. I mean, it's made it all spiritual and even perverted the spiritual aspect. So the thing has to be put back together in a lot of ways, and my emphasis is on putting it back together sort of from the bottom, if you like. And you can also think about it from the point of view of putting it back together from the top. So that's what I was saying about, I guess, which you were talking about when I was talking about Botticelli, is that, okay, it embodies this beautiful symbolism, but is there another Botticelli that's just as beautiful that doesn't embody that symbolism? Is there a Fra Lippo Lippi, which, okay. I mean, for instance, before I converted to Catholicism, I was always a believer. I was never an atheist or a militant atheist. I was always fine with religion. I just wasn't a practicing Catholic. And so I didn't concern myself too much with Catholic iconography. And when I learned about Catholic iconography, I realized that all these paintings that I'd always loved were these certain stories and were illustrating certain things and so on and so forth. And that added a dimension to it, if you like, but it didn't make me love them anymore as painting. So,
Are painters all doing the same thing? What is a painter doing when he paints?
To begin with, they're putting marks on a surface,
Yeah.
and that's where where my major concern comes in. But of course, they're doing more than that.
Why?
Well, okay.
Is there a significance to this act? And what is this impulse? How do we want to characterize and understand this impulse?
Okay, but a lot of people today become painters because it's a prestigious thing to do.
Okay.
So they get into it.
But this is on the surface. You can approach things from the outside, but then it may not be because they're compelled to do it. because there's an advertisement, yeah, and so they go into this bande dessinée, these comics, yeah, these strips, and so they start drawing on the computer because that's cool, because it's the fashion. But this is a compulsion. Is there a natural inclination, not compelled, but a natural inclination to the painting, to the drawing? And if so, then how do we understand that inclination? What is going on there? It can be a stepping point, stepping stone, as it were. This, what you referred to as starting from the bottom or starting from the top, sort of the. But you find this setup, as it were, also in other quarters, in other sort of discussions, yeah, in philosophy quarters, in philosophy departments. So how do we start from the bottom, and what is meant by bottom? Okay, what is meant by top? I mean, is it a sheer abstraction, these symbols that have already been handed down to us? Maybe this.
Well, the top would be what you're talking about. Why? What is the uncompelled natural reason, if there is one, for people to engage in painting? That would be starting at the top.
Wait. However, there's a way to conceive of that as being on the top in terms of ideals. And we've talked about this story about ideals. So we all have this ideal, and that's on top. And then on the bottom, we have the poor fellow who is alone, the individual, as the moderns call him, a term that was originally only attributed to God, who is indivisible. But the individual who is dealing with the material. So at the beginning, there's matter, and then you move on to the spiritual abstraction, spiritualization. And then, of course, that there seems to be something going wrong on the way, because you end up with empty abstractions. And so now the problem of going back, how do we find a middle ground?
I don't see it that way. I mean, I see.
No, I don't either. But this is a problem that comes up in the modern world.
Right, except the question you're asking about yes, the bottom for me would be, how does painting function, and how do you master the functionalities of painting? The top is, what do we want? What are we drawn to? Why are we called to this thing? The people who are. I mean, what's it really about?
Okay, but here, I mean, I'll be pedestrian, yeah? The unity of causality, yeah? And we can look at it in scholastic Aristotelian terms, yeah? The modern world has tended to separate the material aspect, the efficient, in other words, the sort of the agent aspect, from the formal and the final aspect. So what for, and what is the idea that sets things in motion? And so now we end up on the bottom having matter and people working with matter as bodies and matter, as it were, and they're working. And on the top, you have superimposed this ex machina at this point, because they're sort of illusions, dreams that are superimposed to make things prettier, to account for. So here we have these science, religion, pseudo debates. Science gives me the truth, what's really going on, which is the material movement of matter, this little balls banging against each other, and bodies functioning on the super. So the microscopic and the macroscopic being these bodies, composites of this material motion. And then we have their illusions, their projections, into these dreams, the finality. Religion takes care of that. Religion tells us about these dreams and tells us why, and we tell us, science tells you how. I'm concerned about, how do you respond to that? How does this relate to what you were saying? In other words, painting starts from the how, from the craft, and then,
Well,
huh?
well, it's you know, I see what you're saying. That's absolutely right. Except that ultimately, ultimately, and if one is going to be sensible, it's both things at once, and not caving in to this separation of the two things. A vision, my way of talking about it, is to say that consciousness and all that goes with it is understood as a sort of foam that's generated by the chemical swirling of the cosmos. And it's just another chemical result of this chemical interaction. And I don't agree. I think that the cosmos is, it's God somehow. The whole thing is consciousness. So, but that doesn't mean that we're in the cross of we're on the cross of mortality, and that has to be coped with. So it's not enough to have a splendid vision, a splendid natural desire that painting responds to. It's not enough. You still have to acquire the mastery of the art to realize realize that vision. And so we always live on there's a certain paradoxical aspect to all these things that we have to confront. And I'm very oriented towards the problem of the simple mastery of the problem of painting as a material problem, because that's been the adventure of my life, if you like, has been wrestling with that. The other aspect I never had to wrestle with. I always knew that I had some kind of supernal vision that all this is in the service of, if you like. But I didn't, I never, the world never gave me a problem in that way. I mean, I rejected their business of all that is stupid, that isn't real, and you have to invent your own meaning. I rejected that very early. And that was never a problem for me. My problem was that I couldn't get an education, even though I was lucky. I did get some real education, but it wasn't enough. So that was my problem with the world. And that became my adventure. So I don't, I guess it's a question of personal perspective, but for me, doing something wonderful with painting just seems obvious, and people who do evil things with it, to me, are evil, and I don't like it, and I don't want it, and I want it to go away. I can't do anything about it. All I can do is try to make paintings. But in order to try to do something about my little window of supernal vision, I have to slog through the mud. So that's where my attention is. I mean, maybe now something else I say is that, for instance, my conviction about technique is that, and this goes in the sense of what you're saying, technique arises from desire. You want something, and because you want it, you're going to find it because you're looking for it. So you want to do a certain thing in painting. Well, the technique will arise from that desire. It's not like what they think about in schools. Well, you learn this technique and this technique and this technique, and then you can do whatever you want. It doesn't work that way. You have a right desire or a certain desire, and the technique will come to be able to realize that desire. But there's still the problem of acquiring that technique. So I agree with you. You have to have a right leading idea for the true painting technique, so to speak, to emerge. So in a sense, I agree with you. The higher leads the lower. The higher leads to the lower, but it's not. The higher is like a light on a distant mountain, and you've got to slog through swamps and all sorts of things to get there, to approach it.
To stick to the pedestrian representation of Aristotle's formulations, we have a distinction between the form that is hidden within the activity and the end as something that is discovered. And of course, at the end, it may very well turn out that the two are coincide. The end is a return to the form that is hidden in any way. But here, now, on the one hand, we have this very notion of a hidden form being attacked and being rejected by contemporary I hesitate calling them educators. It just doesn't come out. But instructors or ideologues, the discourse of our age. So they reject
perverts.
Perverts. just the dominant perverts, just as the notion of natural right is rejected. It's perverted and reduced to something of the order of power and sort of basic instincts. I don't know how they would refer to them, but we understand each other. So it's everything that is subhuman, as opposed to being something that is reflecting, that is mysterious, that is reflecting divine reality, divine in the sense that it's superhuman, above the human, and mysterious. So now, in the face of this attack, people are left with Hobbesian frogs in the swamps. So what do? We just jump, and there's no providence. There's no hidden providence, right? The return to the pagans means returning to a godless material universe in which the gods are created by men. That's what it means to be a pagan. And so there's no sense to speaking about noble pagan in the, let's say, in Dante's terms, because there's no hidden divinity for them in what they're in political, moral life, in everything they're doing, in their art. And so a return to pagan art, it turns out to be in those conditions, given those presuppositions, it turns out to be an eminent farce. My concern is that that the point of departure of painting has been obscured, the natural point of departure, and this leads to a misconception concerning the telos of painting. Now, when it comes to symbols, I might come up with an article on this, given some questions that were raised elsewhere. Um, sometimes I return to the great interpreter of Western civilization, but not only, Giambattista Vico from the 1700s, and he speaks about symbols. Since we started out with symbols in this discussion, and he makes it clear that the problem of symbols is really the problem of poetry, of heroic language. He speaks of it in terms of heroic language. These are signs, heroic signs that bespeak. And I could summarize his point by characterizing these symbols as, well, metaphors also. It's the problem of metaphors, as mediating what is low and what is high, and not high in the 60s sense. What is low being the earthly, the vulgar, which we confront. It's a corruption of something. We confront it as a corruption because there's something
Well,
wrong.
it's not necessarily vulgar, because
Yeah.
vulgarity is almost a spiritual vulgarity. It's not necessarily vulgar because vulgarity is a spiritual quality. Vulgarity is an attitude.
Yeah. But we're speaking about exactly that. I'm speaking about vulgarity as corruption.
Yeah.
The vulgum, I mean, it's the plebeian, yeah. But there's something. There's something that is. There's a let's put it this way. There's a light that is covered up by dust, as it were, yeah. There's something that has been lost, yeah. And then we are born in a situation of distress, in physical terms, yeah. And we grow up in the middle of a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise pollution, yeah. There's verbal pollution, all kinds of pollutions, and
vulgar
ideas.
corruption.
Yeah, and so we meet this in terms of corruption. When the first Christians speak about the pagans in negative terms, they're speaking about the corruption of the world. Pagan becomes, the state of corruption we find ourselves in. The common pagan is effectively what is common. The pagan man is the common man, and he is in a state of corruption, of decay, in a world of decay. Now, you can't leave it at that, because there's something that it presupposes. This decay, that's why we get upset naturally, upset. Because we don't accept this. Yeah, there's a natural, when we're young at any rate, we don't accept the state of affairs. There's something wrong with it. Now, symbols are you look at the Egyptian language. I mean, these are heroic symbols. They are heroic signs, says Dante, Vico. So these are signs. Of course, you can look at the etymology. You gather, symballo. Yeah, I gather together this world of the dust, and I give it a form, a poetic form, which serves as a mirror in which I can recognize the nobility that has been lost, the divinity that has been obscured by this state of affairs. Obscured at the beginning of Dante, as you know, we have the obscured situation, the dark. It's obscured more than dark. In other words, it's darkened wilderness. And the goal, as it were, is to return to the light that has been obscured. And this is done through this mirror. Now, going back to the painting of Botticelli, the so-called Primavera, where it is not the primavera that is, which is to say the spring that is as a season that is represented, of course. But you know, there, it's a symbolic. You could say it's a symbolic painting. I mean, there's no getting away from that. Now, the challenge is to recognize the significance of the symbols, not in the sense that, you know, in merely with respect to mere terms or definitions, but how the symbols function, and how do we understand these signs that are given to us by Botticelli? Is he not gathering civilization, you could say? He's gathering these fragments. You know, Petrarch has this collection of his, which is basically, carries in the title Fragments. So he's gathering the fragments of civilization from antiquity to the Middle Ages, but and he's giving them a poetic form. He's organizing them into this image. He's going towards the image anyway, because it's poetry, and it's a discussion. But the painter organizes, we could say, to account for the symbolic, he organizes these fragments into a mirror, and this mirror is the symbol, is a metaphor. Is painting not? We had briefly discussed this issue in an earlier video. Is painting speaking about something else? In other words, is it reflecting something else? In this respect, with respect to the question of symbols, is painting not the symbol in which all things are low or gathered or given dignity, so that they may reflect what is not apparent and what is, I mean, you know, the truth. You look at the another painting by Botticelli, the Calumny of Apelles. And in this painting, you're familiar with it, you have the painter dragged on the floor by these horrible people, dragging the poor painter, a young man, to the throne where the king sits with his donkey ears, and these liars and other treacherous girls, each one has her own function, metaphorical function, if you like. You can give them you know, one is deceit, one is gossip, and so forth, an abstract designation. And on the other side of the painting, which is visually on the left, you have an old woman in rags, a witch, you could say, who is covered in dark rags, and who is rejecting the young woman on the far left, who is naked. She's a nude, and she is pointing upward to suggest that beauty bespeaks truth. And so it's not vulgar. There's nothing bad. They're punishing the painter, saying that, oh, he showed a nude. You know, it's terrible. That's simply vulgar. And Botticelli is suggesting, no. When I show the nude, the natural, it is because because it can bespeak truth. And in the painting, nature acquires this character, this quality of the symbolic, you could say, in the respect that it points to truth. It reflects truth. And so you have this beautiful lady, the woman, she's a nude, She's covering politely her, her discreet parts, and with a hand, and her hair covers a bit. Yeah, so it's very discreet, but she's a nude, yeah, and she's delicate, and there's nothing bad about it. There's nothing bad or dirty about it. But they're dragging the painter along because you're just showing us the meat, the sensual. And he says, no, it is in a poetic form. It is a poetic form. He's showing you that the physical has a poetic nature, that it reflects, it bespeaks in the work of the painter, because we cannot see this ordinarily. If you see a nude woman in the street, it's not going to have the same effect. But in painting, he says, it is in a poetic environment, in a poetic setting, this nude bespeaks in its purity.
Yes,
True.
sure. Yeah, except that in that particular painting, you've described, just in what you've said, we're getting the whole message. In other words, it doesn't need that particular painting to give the message. But when there's say, a sublime painting of anything, I mean, it could be an apple, as well as a human body, that message is there. Then the political message of the foolishness of the ruler with the donkey ears and the the different symbols of calumny and so on. I mean, you can do that in painting. Botticelli apparently did. But if you like, that's literature. And his essential message, the message that's proper to painting, you know, it's, again, he did that painting and fine, but that aspect,
okay,
like that,
I mean, I don't know if this is an objection or not, but a parenthesis on this. There could not have been a description, an account, an apology of the painting, because the painting itself is an apologia. It's a defense of painting. But there could not have been my defense of painting without the painting. So my discourse does not pretend to exhaust the painting, to dispense with it, because it is a discourse that points back to the painting.
Except that it could. I mean, Botticelli could make a painting, and Savonarola could have said, you know, this is disgusting. And then you could have stepped forward in the town square and said, Savonarola, you're wrong about this, because, you know, and then you could have essentially said what you just said, and maybe you would have convinced Savonarola,
I don't think so.
And Botticelli wouldn't have been convinced by Savonarola to burn his paintings. So
I don't think so. Yeah.
I'm just saying, that painting, what you're discussing in that painting is things that are possible because of the illustrative power of painting. But that aspect of the illustrative aspect of painting bleeds into narrative.
How about,
and if there were not a painting where, I mean, it's one thing to have the nude pointing up, but if you have a nude that's just lying there and it's so sublime that its sublimity points upwards, that's the message of painting, if you like.
Well, okay,
and that's Renoir's point.
Okay, I think there is a categorical.
I mean, I'm not against paintings telling stories.
Yeah, obviously, because Renaissance and does that all the time.
Well, I mean, you know, so that's there's nothing wrong, you know, but if that should not be mistaken for the essence of painting.
Okay.
And even when paintings tell stories, because, you know, you could tell the same story. Someone else could paint that painting with Apelles being dragged and all the things, and all the symbols being in place. It would have the same literal meaning, and it could just be a dog.
Yeah, but
it could just be some secondary or tertiary thing. So, but it could still contain that symbolical, that narrative meaning,
without beauty,
without being sublime as a painting.
Beauty. Okay, I'm worried a bit about the sublime because
Or say beauty, say beauty. What,
yeah,
you
no,
know,
you know
okay.
why? Do you know why? Because
No.
I'm concerned about this categorical line that is being drawn, the distinction between the vulgar and the poetic. The vulgar and ultimately this is a question of an apology of the poetic element of painting. Apology in the sense of defense. How do you defend the poetic element? The importance, the cardinal importance of poetry in ordinary life, because for them, for painters in the Renaissance, writers in the Renaissance, this was of the essence. How do you defend the properly, for them it was the properly human. How do you defend the human against this tendency to degrade the human, if only in the name of the sublime, which you have in Romanticism a lot. And I've seen people who look at, for instance, Renaissance, even Botticelli painting, and on a certain subject, and they say, well, but there's another romantic painter who deals with that subject in a more sublime manner, and that's more beautiful. Botticelli is less sublime in the respect, but he is more poetic. He is poetic 100%. He is not, I wouldn't consider it sublime. What do I mean by that? I mean, then I can adapt. I mean, I'm not sticking to words, but simply in that context of, in the context of this sort of discussion, you know, with romanticism. That's why I object slightly to the term. Then we can.
I think I understand what you're saying.
You know, you're going overboard. In other words, it becomes too sensual.
To make it more explicit, so the romanticism thing with the sublime, and people start, you know, trembling like this, and then it bleeds into Freudianism, and pretty soon it turns out that the tremble is really movements of the id, and pretty soon you're looking at something hideous, and it's being identified as sublime. So I understand what you're saying.
Well, that could be the unmasking.
I was using the word more innocently.
That's the unmasking of the ideal. So you have this ideal now, all in a sudden, this, and it becomes death in Venice. You know, the ideal collapses and it shows its real face.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is tied to precisely this notion of that you know, painting is about showing. It is about what is shown, and in Botticelli, in the Renaissance in general, we see less of that sublime, of the sensuality. It's much less. Some people say it's more rigid, yeah, and so they're still tied to, you know, forms of representation that you have in the Middle Ages. So you have these art, so-called there's art textbooks that account for the transition from the Middle Ages, where everybody was rigid and the line is more important, and then you gradually soften up, and then, you know, it's easy to draw the line, and you end up with this sublime, and then of course the destruction of sublime, and this is tied in with this the evolutionary discourse that you find in people like Nietzsche. So you, at the beginning, you had the ideas, Platonic ideas. Then you realize these Platonic ideas, they're really hidden in the human psyche. So you have the ideals that are projected, the as ifs and Kant. And then you realize, guess what? These as ifs are really idols that are masks that cover up, as you pointed out just now. So we expose them as idols, and we break those idols with a hammer, and we explode our id, or whatever it is, the will to power, and now it's free. We're all free. So this whole history of everything is a bunch of flatulence. It's just a huge
Oh
babble
yeah. Yes.
for Botticelli, for example, because what is at stake is the poetic and is the genuine nature of the human being. He's not trying to show the exquisite and tell you, here, you stop there. It is a kind of beauty, it is a beauty that is modeste, right? That is very,
Marco,
yeah.
there's, I forget where it is, somewhere in Anatole, France. It's a story. I think it's Anatole, France. It's not Jules. It's not Jules Lemaitre. I think it's Anatole, France. Yeah, and at some point in one of the books, there's a legend of a certain painter of I forget exactly what it is, but it's a painter from just say just before Botticelli, and somehow I don't know, he sees a Botticelli or he sees a maybe he doesn't see a Titian or something like that, but he has this vision of of Titian and everything that goes on from there, and it's the total destruction of painting and the takeover of the universe by the devil, and he's so horrified that he collapses. But there's there's some truth in that, that there is a kind of evolution, but an aspect of that evolution is a collapse of the art of painting. The thing can be read in that way, but at the same time, one has to recognize that along the way, there are wonderful masters who aren't part of the evil evolution. So it's complicated.
Look, there's a degrading, as far as I'm concerned. That's all right, but it's an obscuring of the middle, and when I refer to the poetic, I also was referring to the middle, the problem of the middle, categorical distinctions. Where do you draw the line between the poetic and the vulgar? Also between the human, properly understood, and the merely earthly. Also.
Yeah,
So I'm really focusing on this line that of distinction, of categorical distinction, and suggesting that the symbolic, properly understood, is not about talking beauty away. Why is the little chart not adequate? Although I have nothing necessarily against the little chart, properly done, the chart can help us go back to the painting, but the chart is responding to certain problems. It is part of an apologia, of a defense of the painting, at best. It is getting back. It is helping us get back on track to appreciate elements of this activity that that is constituting the painting, so that we may understand, the right way to approach what is on the surface, to enter it, and to live through it, and to help. This would all help us be guided and educated by the painting. Now, okay, it is not a political manifesto, or an ideological manifesto, rather. It is a guide in this respect to transcendence. And I think that that is the whole point of the painting of this particular case, but in many other cases. In the whole Renaissance, I could say, is about this. All the paintings could be arguably, you can pick one up and we can look at it, and I think I could show that defend the painting, not talk it away, yeah, and so replace it with a bundle of words, but simply defend it in the respect that I could introduce the viewer to the painting, expose him to the painting as this mirror into which he could enter to, yeah, to be educated. Onto what? Onto truth, onto that which transcends appearances, right? And that is ultimately compatible with the surface. It is not just, the chart won't do it. You have to enter that painting. You have to, I just give you a few words, but the words were not meant to say, hey, we solved the problem. We got it all. We figured out. No, we don't have it all figured out. There's simply, yeah, it's sort of, it's a little shuttle that takes you to the moon. Then you're on the moon now, and you, not the modern moon, and now you explore, and now you start breathing it and seeing it as it's supposed to be seen, as it was intended to be seen, and appreciate it, and start, as you discover elements, start cultivating yourself and rise to the level of the painter. Just as the book, Dante, is inviting you to rise to the mind that does not err, la mente che non erra, as he said, which could be God, could be the poet's mind outside of the dream. But, it's about cultivation. He's doing something to you, and he's inviting you on this journey. You have to read the book. It's not enough to read the cliff notes. You have to read Plato's dialogue. You have to explore the painting itself. These are simply notes that, on the one hand, fight against objections, the objections of a Savonarola, the objections also of a romanticism that will say there's no transcendence other than the sublime. They're much more intellectual, you could say, these painters of the Renaissance, without speaking, I think it's not controversial, more intellectual. Then you could say, what's the point of having this intellectual element to it? But in that context, I would suggest.
In one way, I just come back to something I already said, but I think maybe more useful would be to defend your idea of poetry, because today the word poetry is subsumed into this bad idea of sublime. So people will look at, say, Francis Bacon, and they'll say, it's so poetic, it's so
sweet.
How today do we, poetry previously was ineluctably allied to beauty, and beauty was not necessarily divorced from the terrible. So there could be the beauty of a storm, or so there's it's already a problem. There's a certain kind of, there's an aspect of beauty which has to do with awe, and one can be awed by something terrible. So and that's a excuse me. That's an opening for the contemporary idea that that I complain about with the term aesthetics. Everything is aesthetic. Everything is beautiful.
And therefore nothing is.
Yeah, well, everything is, and therefore nothing is. And so in other words, the whole thing disappears. The whole question disappears, and poetry becomes a word which contains nothing but centuries of prestige, which is then, and the centuries of what that actually was is thrown out we take just the the diploma, the little medal which we pin on ourselves, the cloak which we drape ourselves in, and we walk proudly into the ditch. And it's so. In other words, I would coin the term true poetry. And how today does one defend that? And I'm interested in your answer, but I think the first step is to plant a flag, to say no, those things aren't. And then everybody cries, oh, well, this is terrible what you're doing, you're excluding. And then you have to say, yes, I'm excluding. No to that, no to that, yes to that. And that's a brutal, it's starting a war, because a war needs to be started. But anyway, okay.
Yeah, but poetry, that can be done poetically, and that should be done poetically. Poetry is that line.
Well, Nietzsche's poetry of the charging cavalry.
Yeah, okay. Then you have poetry, sort of an anti-poetic poetry, yeah, the cannibalistic deformation of poetry that is really based on very unpoetic principles. I mean, you have a poetry that is rooted in light and poetry that is rooted in the absurd. And there was this Jesuit who wrote.
Is it still poetry?
No, that's what I mean. I mean, it is a kind of a fake poetry. It is an impostor.
What should it properly be called?
An impostor. Okay. Just as sophistry is. Sophistry is an impostor. Is a fake philosophy. Yeah, it's. I mean, I recall many years ago by having a discussion with a sophist, very. Not a rare example of sophistry, simply a pedantic sophist. And these people who a little bit like Umberto Eco, who like to a little bit like these types, who collect all kinds of words and babble with them and pretend and
the worst.
I mean, Ivan Karamazov, these people who like to show I am learned and I can play with words. I can go one way or another to show that finally nothing makes sense and I am the king. At the end of the discussion, a close relative of mine who was close in character to Fedor Pavlovich Karamazov, the father in that story. In other words, somebody who didn't really give a hoot about anything but his belly. He told me, "Oh, you look now you're I enjoyed this. I understood nothing of what was going on, but I enjoyed this exchange, and I thought, you both talked, and." It's sort of saying, it's blah, blah, blah on one side and blah, blah, blah on the other side. You're sort of equals, you're both speaking. And that's great. That's, and you can go back to Socrates and St. Paul goes back to this Socratic point about rhetoric. I'm not a good orator. I'm not a great speaker. I'm not going to flatter you. I'm not going to give you sublime discussions, to refer now back to the term. I'm not going to mystify issues and seduce you. I'm not a mermaid. Again, another symbol, if you like, of seduction and of fakeness. The fake. This fake was not. It's sort of. It spares us the trouble of having to discuss the distinction between the false and the just say fake and the true. It's just an imposture. This is the term that goes today, but which has been also adopted by the it was I believe that this term fake was brought to the fore of public discussion by President Trump, and then it was picked up by the opponents, and his initial talk about fake was replaced by these fact checkers, and so it was taken onto the other side, it was thrown back against him. Anyway, the fake is the imposture, and we live in an age of imposture precisely because this, even notions, the very notion of natural right is thrown out of the window. The notion of divine providence in the early Christian terms, and so you have the pagans that were really working on the basis of, and moved by the divine from within. This is thrown out of the window, and we have an essentially, yes, materialistic, clearly, society, essentially. But it's not enough, because the material is now understood in progressive terms. So it flows into our society, and so Heidegger and so forth. But the poetic element is responding. Poetry is a response to this vulgarization, this degrading in the original sense. So is there an original natural impulse that can be qualified as poetic? Poetry, of course, is the making, poiesis. But again, what is this making? In an article on that dismantles a collection titled "Mastery of Nature" by eminent professors a few years ago, I highlight this distinction between a modern approach to poetry, the poetic, the making, ultimately, yeah, the poiesis, a poiein, this making, as in terms of building. So this is really about empowerment. The more we build, the more we make, and the greater and more sublime, and the better in general. So this is the end. The goal is growth. The goal is to transcend the origins, the beginnings. And then you could speak about still a classical and Renaissance understanding of poetry in terms of reflecting in proper terms. Now it's a question of focusing, the lens, as it were, reflecting the origins. So the origins, so this has to do with a poetry of return, not a progressive poetry, which is a modification, a radical modification, if we like, and parasitic, I would add, to the original natural poetry. The original impulse of man is that of return. Yeah, the progressive impulse is a modern impulse. You will not find it anywhere prior to modernity. This is the early modern thinkers understand themselves, propose themselves as absolutely revolutionary, in the respect that they have something that is radically new, vis-a-vis everything that came earlier. We had been, whether you want to pick on Machiavelli or Hobbes or go all the way down to Marx, and then they project their modernity on everybody else. This is the academics of our age, where everybody has been potential moderns. But the point was that everybody was oriented towards origins, however they understood them, however they conceived of these origins in various ways, but it was still a matter of returning to the good, the return to the good. And I think that as long as this is where there's been this corruption and imposture of poetry. Poetry now serves futuristic purposes. It is about building. It is about moving forward. It's not about returning to what is hidden and that is good. It is, if you return to what is hidden, it's just because it's the id that has to be propelled forth and liberated and into the building of a new society, or whatnot. So the origins are not good.
That's the
That's the
modern.
imposture. That's the imposture.
Yeah.
So if they're not good, then poetry is not good, maybe. What about the impulse that is driving poetry? That's not good either. I have a problem with that.
Well,
And Botticelli does too.
that's a profound point, Marco. But it's one of those. It's like the contradiction of relativism, the contradiction of modernism. If we're in this movement towards the future, well, you can resolve the contradiction by saying that we're of necessity in a bad place, and we have to purify and correct everything. That would be the response. Yes, everything is bad, and there has been this golden impulse to to destroy everything because it's bad, and this golden influence is gaining more and more power until ultimately it will prevail.
Speak about an imposture of Christianity. For so long, as I understand, Christianity was blamed for having demonized the flesh. Everything is bad, and original sin discourse is to be shunned in favor of more of a brighter view of things. And then, what is this brighter view? That everything is feces, and we're coming from feces, and everything is bad at the beginning. We have to mold and remold, and makeup has to be applied to the feces so that they look good and they turn into a wonderful society that at its core is feces. But never mind, you can't help that. Maybe we'll be able to just have a mask and no more face. So let's apply 2 masks and 3 masks and 4 masks, and then finally we'll be able to forget it, take the face off, and we'll just have masks going around. And this, of course, reverberates in the.
There'll be enough thickness to them that they'll become the thing.
Yeah, they'll become the face itself. So, the years ago I was. Yeah. Well, years ago,
if you use the word.
Just to re-articulate the same problem, years ago I was telling students, giving the students the image of a balloon that is applied to a faucet, and you open the faucet, and the balloon starts filling up with water, and at some point you have a little hole because it starts bursting, and water leaking, of course, squirting out, and another one, and what do? Well, you start applying patches. You patch up the balloon, patch everywhere, and before you know it, you have the balloon all covered up with patches. And at that point, you say, you know what? Of course, you're not thinking about closing the faucet. No, you just let it flow, because that's life. That's the impulse, and just let it fill up. And you figure, you know what? We don't even need the balloon. We'll just have these patches. No more balloon. Solve the problem. It's the same mentality. So lies. The imposture will be the truth. If you just work hard enough on impostures, who will need the truth anymore? Dorian Gray's painting will be enough. You won't need the other guy. You should be able to throw him out the window and bring out the painting. That's all. That's all that counts. That's pretty gruesome, but
and yet
power.
We retain the word poetry, we retain the word beauty, we retain these words, and we pervert them, and we build these fake empires on them, and yet those words are still there, and so they're a witness of the origin
Yes, but there's we're at the on the one hand you have, and this article that should be out on towards the end of February on heroism, poetic heroism addresses that, right? A situation where it starts with reference to McIntyre, and so we have this dystopia, which is almost a journalistic account of what is happening, of course, where we are ruminating on, we're just on these words that have lost the original sense, and in our usage of them, in our speech. So we don't know where we're babbling, we're borrowing, we're speaking echoes. Yeah, we're uttering echoes of. It's all confused. We have not solved the problems. We have just end up in a huge confusion of terms. And we say this and we say that, and tyrants love that, you could say, in their perverted manner, because they don't want people knowing what they're talking about. And so you have all kinds of fake debates where one side attacks the other, and over what they don't even know. And they, if you wanted to dig out the ground, they'll say, no, there is no light to be unearthed. There's no light, there's no providence, there's no reason. It is all feces. We just have to build up on the feces, cover it up, and it's inevitable to have these debates, this chaos, and yes, rip your hair out, and let's end up in Gomorrah. Yes, why not? This is hellish. It's absolutely hellish. It is very stupid, and poetry is the only and proper response, a good response to the situation. It is the working through, and the good painting, I think, does that. It works with this effort. You refer to technique. As far as I'm concerned, there's no technique, but just the working out of this poetic, original, good impulse that works, makes an effort. It is as you try to climb out of a dark pit into the light. You have to make an effort and come out, and you have to try to figure out firsthand where to place your hands, and how to move, and what to avoid, and perhaps just learn how to.
If you want to climb up, you'll figure out how to climb up.
Yeah. But if you just read the book and okay, I have the technique, now I go, and you have to just. But that's part of coming out. There's
but you yeah? Again, you wouldn't go for that technique if you didn't have the impulses that corresponded to that technique. In other words,
there's no rules. There's no rules that are.
It's the rules are technique. Call it the way. If you want certain things to happen in painting, there's certain things. It's like if you want to move from one side of the room to the other side of the room, you have to walk. You have to get upright and.
It's a shadow. I mean, I'm not thinking about this when I get up. When I get up, I get up. Then you can analyze the movement of my atoms and molecules. But
with painting, you have to learn how to walk before you can learn how to run.
I have a.
I don't think people are motivated to learn those things unless they're oriented. This goes in your sense, unless they're oriented in the right direction, because otherwise, why bother? Absolutely. It just seems mindless.
I am. It is in a very.
And then if you're correctly oriented,
yeah,
it becomes as simple in a way as learning to walk, which might not be simple or whatever, but it's.
You have to make an effort.
Yeah, and eventually it becomes a complete evidence. It's become something that's so obvious you don't think about it. But
Why?
today
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it has to be thought about because these things have become completely obscured.
Okay, but look, I mean, why should a child sit up straight for breakfast? Why
Because
not
of his
just,
father.
well, why bother? Eh? Why bother? Sit up straight, you know? It's demeaning if you act like a human being, carry yourself up, straight, and eat properly, not like a pig. I mean, why? Is that a technique? Is there a technique for that? It's just
Well,
propriety.
eventually, Marco, eventually, some people who never had that and who get into very bad habits, eventually they have to make a terrible spiritual effort to go towards that thing. And some people never manage it.
Okay, but the problem for me, how do I approach this educational problem with,
Spare the rod, spoil the child. Ancient wisdom.
where's my stick?
But you're living in a world where they've taken the rod from you and they have warned you that if you reach for the rod, they're going to stick you right in jail. In other words, your children are condemned to becoming slovenly pigs.
Yeah, well, that's what they want. That's what they want. The
The city of pigs.
ideologues, absolutely, that's the city of big is what the ideologues want, what they're after. But I'm afraid that you, I won't bother with techniques. I just I could be
Well,
going to my child and explain to him how the left foot goes this way and the right foot goes the other way. And
well, I mean,
are we out of our
technique
minds?
is
No,
technique is not. Yeah,
no,
technique is not my word of choice.
no, no.
It's
Yeah, okay. So I would say, first of all, I'm not even going to explain. Rousseau has this in the Emile has this a bit rusé, a bit cunning approach to this because he says, have somebody else do the dirty work,
dirty work.
and so that he will never blame you.
Right.
Otherwise, but the worst thing you could do, he says, is to start. Okay, but is to start to have him somebody else flatter him into the good way. But the worst thing you can do is start arguing with them in terms of details, and then the kid will start asking, but why this? Why should I be doing this and not another way? And you start getting into all these details, which becomes all very abstract and very irrelevant and ultimately gratuitous. And you won't see the point to it. It's a castle of cards. Why should I be sitting straight? Oh, because the foot has to go this way and the atoms. Why does my heart beat? Oh, because the blood goes this way. No. Listen. He says, so Rousseau says, if you cannot manage the other way with the gentle way through the third intermediary, the worst thing you can do is get into those detailed discussions. Just make it snappy. Just order him into it. Authority. Bang. And that's it. And then you move on. You move on. He'll forget about it. But he needs that authority at that point. Okay. It's that's the way it is.
Things are so much simple. Things are so much simpler. If authority is wise, then it's a fast track. And now we have evil authorities.
Yeah. But those are called fake authorities. That means tyrants, who are, to go back to Pinocchio, these are the imposters. The imposters, the cat and the fox and so forth. These are the imposters who tell you don't listen to your father, who is the snake in the garden, of course. But so I would at this point, if there is, to speak at this point in our condition, present situate predicament, to speak about technique, for me it is as if I were to speak about technique to my child as I try to get him to sit straight at the table. if you're sitting sloppy, it's too late for technique. It's as if I were trying to teach somebody how to use a gun when he has evil impulses. I'd rather him not to. If he can't get back to basic civil piety, yeah, a basic good orientation, basics, yeah, basic good orientation. I don't want him to become a painter. I don't want him to become anything. I don't want him to acquire any kind of power or skill, name it. Nothing. Forget about it. Go back to the field and start working near the land. And I tell this to anybody, to any students who want to go to university.
But you can't. We have to be confined in our houses. We're not allowed to work.
Well, okay. Get no internet. I mean, I don't know. I mean, start building up a community. Everybody in the streets. I don't know. I mean, it's the complete alienation, the destruction of society. This is pure sophistry. The emphasis on technique.
Talk about alienation. In the name of fighting alienation, they've alienated everybody.
Yeah,
it's absolutely amazing.
Well, poetry is the only to get back on
track
here, the only way out.
What is poetry? What is true poetry?
I repeat, it is we can now, to simplify matters, we can return to the etymology. It is a making. Now, okay, producing. It's a production, a human production, properly human production that has its specifically human function and telos, which is to mirror. The child is the first poet. It's about imitation. Yes, poetry is about, we once learned, it's about imitation. But then, you know, what is it imitating? It's imitating. When you look at the tree outside in the field, it doesn't speak to us, as Socrates would point out. We need to recreate the tree, because the tree that our senses, as it were, perceive is not self-evident. It doesn't function very well as a mirror of truth. We can't hear it. The modern objection, of course, is just that you should just hug the sublimity of the tree and that'll speak for itself. That's baloney. So we need to recreate it. There's the artistic, craft, but in the sense of art, but in the sense of poetic, the poetic work, the poetic art, which is about, and which starts, it's a natural impulse. We're children, we're imitating. We're not trying to build up to the photograph of the tree. So imitating in that mechanical sense, but we're trying to recreate the genesis of the tree. How is it that that tree is present to our perception, to our senses? And we're trying to account for that presence of the tree. And in doing this, in working and struggling, in making this effort to, and we draw it again and again and again. What are we after? What are we after? We're after this genesis, accounting for the presence of that tree in our experience. And then finally, to realize that somehow that tree that we had seen with the senses is like our tree, that it became present as a work of art, that it's not just there materially, forming spontaneously, as it were, and just like that, yeah, but it is somehow the product of art. Of course, we know in the discourse of early medieval Christianity, nature is the art of God. So the tree is actually the product of art. There's a divine art, divine poetry, as opposed to the human. which is derivative. And so now you have the whole discussion between, divine poetry that makes the tree itself and the human, the merely human, and how do you get them together. But my point is that, even to return to Aristotle, nature should be understood in terms of art, not just art in terms of as imitation of nature. So poetry now is producing that image, that tree, okay, that allows you to see, as a human being, allows you to see and to live out truth, to come back to the origin of the raison d'être also of this tree. So we absolutely not only want, but ultimately the society needs this poetry. It needs this childlike impulse developed through a lot of work, a lot of effort, because it is simply the stump. It is simply a little sprout in the child, but it needs to be worked out. Look at how painting has been diminished in the contemporary schooling system. They don't see the point of it. You have photographs. No, that's horrible. That's an imposture, absolute imposture, a mechanical deus ex machina. No, terrible. It misses the whole point. You're working. It's a spiritual effort. It's a spiritual work to rework the sensory world in poetic terms, means to offer the world a stage for contemplation, for return, for education, for discussion, for return to the good as the creative principle of the universe, if you like, of our experience. So painting is absolutely of paramount importance to education, to a proper education, and of course it's been thrown out of the window for all practical terms, basically thrown out of the window by modern schools. That's what I would say in a few words about what poetry is. The rest is rubbish. Oh, creation of beauty and this beautiful picture to the sublime, and that's all very nice. Yes, beauty, yes, but beauty in what terms? In terms of a mirror, in terms of a platform for discussion, of education, of cultivation, and return to the good. That is what the printemps, the so-called the spring, the primavera of Botticelli is. It is a Silva. In the Renaissance, he was a student of Dante, as you know. It is a Silva in Politian's and Statius's terms, the Roman Statius, a poetic, justement, a poetic stage for cultivation, for understanding, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful stage. If it were not beautiful, why is it beautiful? Because it is a natural product. It is natural to human nature. It is the human nature. It is the divine that is at work, actually, ultimately, in the creator. It is the divine within the human that is ultimately producing this stage, this poetic stage for civilization. Without it, civilization cannot develop, cannot bloom, cannot flourish, cannot save itself from decaying into barbarism. It is absolutely important. We want it, we desire it by nature, but our desire is crippled by bad ideas, by ideologies, by all kinds of rubbish that seduces us into replacing it with imposters. Now, all of a sudden, we're compelled to produce and to build fetishes for the market. Painting now becomes a fetish for the market. That's horrible. It's dehumanizing. It's an abomination. That means against human.
Well, I'm a little traumatized by everything you just said, because for rather personal reasons, because for years and years and years. I mean, literally all through the late 70s and 80s and into the 90s, I tortured myself, struggling and struggling to be able to do something about trees. I never thought about it in the terms in the terms you're using. I was always trying to, I guess, as I would put it today, trying to say something adequate about a tree. And you know, you articulate it in ways completely beyond anything I could do. But I certainly, I never saw my motivation in those terms, but it's very beautiful what you say. And I'm not sure, I'm very moved by it, but I'm not sure if I had heard, well, I guess if I had heard that discourse in the mid 70s, I guess I would have felt encouraged by it. Yeah, I would have felt encouraged by that. I think that would have cast some light on my problem if I'd heard that when I was in my 20s. And I guess now that you said that to me, I guess I can begin to understand what I try to do in terms like that. So yes.
We're all in it together.